Welcome, good afternoon to the T20 Summit, delivering for people, planet, and prosperity. Today, on our first session, we will talk about migration. So let me start by launching a video with the key policy recommendations from the T20 Task Force on Migration. And then we're going to discuss that here.
The dramatic events in Afghanistan unfolding these days have made the question that has been addressed by the group even more timely and important. We will have definitely, we don't know yet the entity of the exodus of asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, generally speaking, from Afghanistan, for instance. These people have to be integrated in a proper labor market, starting from, of course, training in languages. It's also a question of vaccination and due to the COVID-19. And we must ensure that all the refugees, whatever their status, have access to vaccination and a proper health system. Women are the ones who deal with bureaucratic passages in their new life, so they are the ones who need and are prone to integration more than colleagues or migrant men. These people come with different cultures, different languages, and to be properly integrated in the labor market, the first thing they need is education. And the question that we have to further reduce the cost of sending remittances, which makes, again, the question of financial education, but from refugees in our countries and to their family back home.
Thank you to Mrs. Bonino. Now we have a conversation with two main speakers, and they have really a privileged point of observation in order to tell us what's happening there. So let me introduce James Megan, a director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies Program, Laureate Institute, University of Pennsylvania, and Antonio Vittorino, Director General, International Organization for Migration. And gentlemen, I leave you the conversation.
Good day, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are as a part of this T20 Global Forum. It is a great honor for me to be in conversation with Vittorino and Antonio Vittorino, not because I'm the think tank guy, but because my real job is as a professor of international studies. And so I teach and have taught for over 30 years international law, international organizations, and global issues. And as a part of global issues, clearly one of the main areas of focus is on forced migration. And as a part of this conversation, what I'd like to do is, one, we are very lucky to have Antonio Vittorino as the person that I'm in conversation with today, because he has a long and distinguished or sustained commitment to what is the central focus of this, or one of the pillars of this T20 Summit, delivering for people and essentially protecting the most vulnerable. And clearly, those who are in the most vulnerable position are those that are either voluntarily or through forced migration are forced to travel cross borders in search of safety and a better life. So it is a great honor that I am in conversation with Antonio Vittorino, who has worked on this issue, is committed to it, and part of what I try to impart in my class is that there are thousands of people around the world working on global issues, and that intergovernmental organizations like the institution that Antonio heads, the International Organization for Migration, are working day in and day out to try to address these issues and problems. And so first, Antonio, I would like to pose for you a question. Poverty, inequities, conflict, and natural disasters are on the rise and will increase migration flows. However, these issues do not usually play a central role at the G20. How can we strengthen the international cooperation required to address these challenges? Antonio?
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today and to speak with you, James. Absolutely, you are right. Poverty, inequalities, conflict are on the rise, and they are the trigger of migratory flows. And let's be honest, COVID-19 has exacerbated all the vulnerabilities that existed previously to the pandemic. But the ability to move is not equally shared by all. I could even say, and might sound a little bit controversial, that those living in the poorest parts of the world may have the least capacity to move, and critically to move in a safe and regular way. And I have seen the video from Emma Bonino, and let's look a little bit on Afghanistan as a concrete example. Migration has always been a coping mechanism for Afghans to deal with protracted political conflict, climate change, especially the drought, but also poverty, inequality, and food insecurity. There are more than 5 million Afghans living abroad, mainly in Iran and in Pakistan. And those migrants are responsible for 800 million US dollars remittances that they sent back in 2020 to alleviate the hardship of their families in the country of origin. And as of today, we are speaking, we do not see any major exodus out of Afghanistan because of the 15th of August takeover. But what, yes, we see is that there are 5 million Afghans internally displaced. And if the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan aggravates, it is likely that those people will be forced to move and to migrate, starting with the neighboring countries. So what can we do? That's the question. And in fact, the international community, like IOM, as a UN agency with all other UN agencies, we try to mitigate the impacts of the political, of the economic, of the climate shocks in those who are more vulnerable. And what can the G20 do? Well, in fact, the vast majority of the G20 countries have adopted the Global Compact on safe, regular, and orderly migration that was endorsed by the UN in 2018. It is a political platform of cooperation because no single country can handle the magnitude of the migratory challenge. And that political platform, the Global Compact, provides us with a framework and a list of actions that states commit to undertake in order to attain the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goal, specifically poverty and equalities, but at the same time, to create legal pathways for migration so that migrants are not prone to traffickers and smugglers who are the perpetrators of the most obnoxious violation of migrant human rights. Political will, international cooperation, and mobilizing not just the institutions, but also the civil society, particularly the philanthropic world and the private sector, to address the vulnerabilities of those who are forced to migrate because of poverty, because of economic shocks, because of political instability, and because of climate change.
Antonio, before we move on, wanted to just have you comment on the fact that of the what is now generations of refugees who are living in camps, and so that how do we deal with that problem in terms of normalizing the life for children and for families, and how is the international community dealing with that problem where large numbers of refugees are in countries and in those countries for sustained periods and in some cases for generations?
Well, 80% of the refugees worldwide are in low and middle income countries. That is the reality. So, and in a number of countries, we have refugee camps where we have already three generations. The ones who are refugees, their children, and their grandchildren. This happens in Kenya, this happens in Somalia, this happens in Uganda, this happens with the Palestinian refugees in Jordan. So what we consider the priority is to guarantee that in those camps, while there are no durable solutions in practice, which is one of the problems, we have education and teaching for the new generations. And I can give you one concrete example. You have 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. And it has been quite a task for UNICEF, for UNHCR, for IOM to set up schooling in those camps, because nobody can afford a lost generation because of being a refugee. They are not entitled to access to education. The same can be said about the Syrian refugees in Turkey or in Greece. So it's very important to create not just minimal conditions for living for the refugees, but also looking to the future, investing in preparing the future generation, as well as finding durable solutions for those who are in those camps. Living in a camp is not a solution. It should be a transitional situation for immediate humanitarian action, but then we need to think about what are the durable solutions to be implemented and how those people who are in the camps are prepared to face that challenge and find an alternative livelihood.
Antonio, the next question is, given the increased intensity and frequency of natural disasters driven by climate change, and then the related impact on migration, how is your organization planning for preparing for that new reality where there will be increased migration as a result of climate change driven events?
James, you touch upon a very crucial issue. I do support the discussions in COP26 about the reduction of emissions in 2030, in 2040, in 2050. That's fine. But the reality is that today we have already millions of people who are living the experience of climate change and being forced to move because of climate change. And climate change is linked to other key elements, like, for instance, food insecurity. Recently, the World Food Programme and IOM have published an interesting report on how food insecurity due to climate change is a trigger for migration, for mobility. But not just the issue of food insecurity, it's also the rise of the level of the waters in Papua New Guinea, or the salinization of the lands that is at the basis of the conflict between herders and farmers at the Sahel region, making that more than 2 million people there are displaced because of the impact of climate change. So our appeal is for the international community in the negotiations on COP26 to include a specific focus on the impacts of climate change in human mobility, with two main purposes. First, adaptation and mitigation of the impacts, because the communities that are affected by climate change need to build their own capacity of resilience in front of the environmental events. But secondly, we need to reduce the potential for disasters. And disasters, natural hazards, but also sometimes man-made, force people to move. So we are very much hopeful that COP26, the international community, and the G20 countries will mobilize to find the necessary financial tools to address not just the future of climate change, but the impacts of climate change today.
Antonio, Vittorino, thank you very much. It is with great confidence and hope that having someone like you in the position that you're in to address the critical issues of climate change, food and water insecurity, and making sure that the global community is aware and mobilized to address it is
All right.
a wonderful thing. And I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Okay, I have to say that I want to remember my guests that they have the time slot given to them. I like them to respect the time slot given. Thank you so much. So let me move on, talking about digital transformation. So I'm gonna ask my first guest to come here, Dennis Snower, President Global Solutions Initiative from Germany. Thank you, Mrs. Snower. Our first speaker, keynote address of this session, will be from Vint Cerf, Chief Internet Evangelist from Google. Mr. Cerf, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I hear you very well. My first question to you, as a father of the internet, as people define you, what is your view on the contribution of the internet to well-being and quality of life, and how far we are from granting universal internet access? You have 4 minutes for your reply. Thank you.
This is like being asked to describe the universe in 25 words or less. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I really appreciate it. The internet was turned on in 1983 and the World Wide Web arrived in 1993, roughly speaking. And those two inventions together have invited an enormous quantity of information to flow into the thing that we call the World Wide Web and the internet. What's important about it is that in the absence of tools like the search engines that we run at Google, no one could find anything. And so in the ensuing some 30 years now, people have found an enormous quantity of useful information on the internet. They've found ways to do commerce on the internet. They've found ways to educate on the internet, which we've all been forced to do since the beginning of the pandemic. We've accelerated the use of the internet for educational purposes. So the internet has brought enormous value and new businesses to the table, and new opportunities for people to learn and to carry out their businesses. So on a positive side, the internet has contributed enormously to economics, education, and research. I mean, during the course of the pandemic, the exchange of information across the internet accelerated our ability to produce vaccines, for example. So there are a lot of positive things to be said about the net. And I have to say, in the previous session on migration, it came to mind that many people who end up in the refugee camps often ask, the first thing they ask for is access to Wi-Fi or access to 4G or 5G so they can communicate and get information. So the internet is there waiting for them, but it's only there for about half the world's population. So we're working very hard to get the rest of the world online, making all these benefits available. One way that's happening is increasing numbers of undersea cables. But the other thing, which is quite exciting, is the arrival of low Earth orbit satellites that in theory will allow access anywhere in the world to the internet's value.
Very interesting. And as you said, the internet has created a lot of opportunities by spreading knowledge, of course, but also increasing interactions between people. But it is also raising many concerns, from privacy to security to fake news to spreading violent language on the web. How to build a better internet for the future?
Well, this question occupies my thinking for 24 hours a day, to be honest with you. You can imagine that our purpose when we got the internet and World Wide Web going is to lower the barrier for access to information, for sharing of information. Unfortunately, when you lower the barrier for everyone, you lower it for people who don't have your best interests at heart. They want to spread misinformation and disinformation. They want to use this platform to launch denial of service attacks, malware or ransomware. So we have this big challenge in front of us, which is how to preserve all the value of the internet and the World Wide Web while at the same time protecting people's privacy, safety, and security. And so there are technologies that we are all using increasingly, cryptographic techniques in order to protect safety and security, to do strong authentication. But we also need, as Hulan Zhao will tell you, increasing amounts of cooperation across international borders in order to track down people who are doing harmful things. And as you know, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has called for digital cooperation on a broad scale. And I am a big proponent of that cooperative effort. So we have a lot of work to do collectively to make the internet a safer and more secure place for everyone. And if we don't succeed at that, no one will trust it. And of course, all of its value will dissipate. So the challenge is real, the challenge is now, and the challenge is in front of all of us who can contribute to safety and security.
Thank you, Mr. Cerf. It has been brief, but intense. Thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, let me start the panel discussion. I have already introduced Mr. Snower, and then there is Sharon Thorne, Deloitte Global Board Chair, and Hulin Zhao, Secretary General for International Telecommunication Union. Let me start with you, Mr. Snower. Over the past few years, there have been several scandals, right? About the privacy, for example, the use of the personal data without the permissions of the users. How should state and companies deal with these kind of things, generating more disclosure, for example, online?
I think we have to differentiate very clearly between the advantages of the internet that we've heard and the grave dangers from digital governance currently. In the offline world, if you share information, there are safeguards, there are contracts, there are non-disclosure agreements, there's regulation and so on. This largely does not exist in the online world. And manipulation exists because it's not disclosed. There are many actors involved in the manipulation, and there's very little recourse. In order to deal with it, we should proceed similarly to the offline world. There is private data that is generated by the individual. The individual should have complete rights over that data on how it's disposed of. It should not be the property of someone else.
Exactly.
If there is private data that is put together by other people, like a psychological profile constructed by Facebook, then it should be governed by relations just like between doctors and patients or lawyers and clients, that the interests of the user have to be paramount, and there should be safeguards to ensure that that's the case. With regard to official data, such as your name, your passport number, property, everything for which there are official records, that should be officially authenticated, and that should be the only legal source of that data. And finally, with data that is shared, there should be a data commons that is well defined, and those who organize the data commons should have a fiduciary duty to conduct that data commons in the interests of the users. And then we would be in a different world. It is quite simple. Simply follow the offline world where we've had 100 years to think about these problems and apply them to the online world.
And it seems so simple, just listening to you, right? So simple to do, but in reality, it's not like that. Just they should follow, as you say, the offline rules. It should be great. Mrs. Thorne, how do we ensure digitalization doesn't exacerbate inequality, especially, for example, as far as SMEs are concerned? What do you think?
Thank you. Delighted to be here and part of the discussion.
Thanks.
I believe digitization can exacerbate or alleviate inequality depending on how it permeates an economy. On the one hand, in the absence of suitable regulation and policy, it's the wealthier households and larger businesses that can leverage digital technologies early on, reinforcing advantages they already have, and therefore further exacerbating that inequality. And this was all too evident during the COVID-19 lockdowns, when those who were able to transition to digital remote working, typically those in higher paid jobs, were able to carry on working from home and thus did not experience a disruption in income. And larger businesses were more readily able to take advantage of evolving consumer demands by pivoting to online sales and adapting their supply chains. One of the critical elements to this is resilience. We saw many small businesses demonstrate real resilience in how they adapted and responded to the changing conditions. For example, distilleries that shift from making gin to making hand sanitizer, protecting themselves and serving the public good at the same time. However, companies need a route to market if they are to continue expanding and reaching new customers, which is where we have seen technology, like social media, play a big role in dramatically accelerating and expanding the success of small businesses and sole traders. And there are many instances of new technologies making previously underserved markets more accessible and profitable. For example, by lowering the cost to serve, which improves accessibility for smaller businesses and rural communities. And the dramatic steps forward in fiscal inclusion for SMEs and households alike, enabled by fintech. And also we've seen the ease with which smaller companies can manage their HR and legal matters through low-cost digital and on-demand solutions. Digital technologies, when implemented ethically and with social purpose in mind, have the power to reduce inequality by lowering barriers to access that have traditionally reinforced inequality. Just 50 years ago, the television and radio democratized access to entertainment and the news. And so now we have, the near ubiquitous access to smartphones, marking the advent of far more open access to opportunities such as education, healthcare, market information, and a myriad other opportunities. However, these technologies can also present a number of moral and ethical dilemmas including exacerbating inequalities if there's a gap in access. In this context, organizations today have a duty to ensure that companies have the right culture in place to leverage data and technology in responsible and ethical ways. This means ensuring they're bullish on transformation and new ideas, but also serving an expanded social purpose beyond making a profit. And I think government and the social sector can also play a big part in helping assure and accelerate these benefits. Firstly, by ensuring universal access to the necessary infrastructure. Secondly, incorporating digital skills into education. And finally, designing the rules of new markets in ways that reinforce the attractiveness of serving previously excluded populations.
Thank you. Mr. Zhao, the demand for digital technologies and services has skyrocketed after the COVID pandemic, as you know very well, standing in sharp contrast to the slowing growth in internet users, for example, but also lack of sufficient investments in ICT. How can we reverse this kind of path that we have right now?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join my friend Vint and others like Shannon, to have the discussion on this important issue. Today we talked a lot about ICT importance, and we talked a lot about ICT beneficial to everybody. And this is, I think that we should recognize the invaluable contribution of people like Vint at the early time to develop internet, and to also share this power tool with everybody, to encourage everybody to use the internet. So that is absolutely remarkable for us to get our life today be enjoyable. But on the other hand, we also know that all this only beneficial to those connected. We still have half population not connected yet. And how can we connect the other half? That is a big challenge to all of us. And if we cannot bring other half be connected, I think that that is big trouble for the whole planet. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, last year called for everybody to unite to bring everybody connected by 2030. And just imagine that half population not connected yet. And for those connected, who are contributed that kind of work, we must recognize that the private sector play a very important role. And the ICT infrastructure up to now is mainly contributed by private sector. And technology is also promoted or developed by a private sector. So that we have to keep private sector be actively engaged with us. However, if we only leave this private sector, the situation may not be changed dramatically. Up to now, half population connected, thanks to them. But why is the other half not connected? Because the other half are staying in the poor area, not a profit to the investors. So that it's very hard to get them there. So that one we need to create, the public authority needed to create good environment to encourage private sector to go to this. And here we also have a trouble that people consider that the ICT is profitable always, all time, everywhere. So therefore, we don't need to worry about ICT investment. Let them be developed by themselves. They are sustainable. I think it's very dangerous. And again, let me highlight, today, half public not connected. Why? Because this is not for profitable. If we don't change this mindset, that situation will not be changed dramatically. And to reach everywhere, be connected by 2030, it's just a joke. So that we have to change our mindset to encourage good investment in the ICT continuously. And today we also have another problem up to now that the ICT invested by ICT workers, ICT investors. And then, that for each particular country, you see that the ICT is recognized very important for everything, for everyone. But then that infrastructure of ICT still remain mainly in the hand of ICT authority in the private sector, while many other ecosystems like education, like public health, they have their goals to improve their system with ICT. But each of them do their business by themselves. That is not the best way. And everybody try to get their share of the investment. That is a fight between different ministries of public curriculum. So I think that we need to change our mindset to put this as a national strategy to get everybody united to really go together to develop a national strategy for ICT development and to encourage more investment in ICT. And otherwise, I think that, and then Shannon talked a lot about the SME. I totally agree with her. And in fact, it's also one of my points that SMEs not only create a job, not only push the development of social economic development, but the ICT SMEs are really main force of our investment, main force of our innovation. They know local challenges, they know local communities, they're eager to bring their new technologies to their local community with their own application solutions that are suitable for their local community. So this are very important part of our business. We have to engage them entirely. And Vint said, again, he himself is international, globalization promoters. And otherwise, we will not give his investigation, innovation of internet to public. Now he still call for public, cooperation partnership. I totally agree with him, and he challenged me to talk more about this international cooperation. I totally agree with his proposal that we all have to work together, not only among different agencies, not only between different parts of the government, but also more importantly to work together to engage with the private sector to create a good environment to encourage more investment in ICT.
Thank you so much.
That is absolutely important.
Thanks. Mr. Snower, data are considered the new oil. My question is, how can we reward the value of this sort of information, at the same time protect the users of that information and the owners of that information? For example, if I have something in Rome, I can go to the hospital and I can use my data that are here in Milan in my hospital, and these data can be shared. But now it's not possible to do that. But at the same time, I have to protect my privacy, of course. How can we do that?
I think we can do it in the same way as we have done it in the offline world. I think it is very important for us to consider the situation that we had in the darkest days of the Industrial Revolution, where it is clear that the Industrial Revolution created a lot of wealth. It is also clear that we should invest more and help the private sector generate more of this wealth. But that does not justify the worst miscarriages of social justice that took place in the Industrial Revolution. Now, if we gave people rights to the data that they themselves generate and data about themselves, gave them control over this, then we could first of all grant rights of association to users, and this big asymmetry of power between the digital service providers and the users could start to be broken. Secondly, we could protect the rights of vulnerable users in ways that is actually meaningful because there is control over data that they themselves have. Thirdly, we could make competition law applicable to the big digital service providers. Currently, these digital services, natural monopolies, huge concentration of power. And finally, we could have data traffickers submit to GAAP type oversight, so supervision according to generally accepted accounting principles, to make sure that the data is secure and inclusive. And so I think the central aspect that we have to keep in mind is give users control over the data that they have, and then give them the rights that they already have in the offline world in the online world.
Which is one of your mantra, and I really agree so much with you on this. Mrs. Thorne, with low-skilled workers, a risk of losing their jobs in this sort of environment where artificial intelligence or robots, of course, are so many present. How can the private sector contribute to the upskilling, to the education of these workers, and to the future of this digital area?
So in January 2020, just before the COVID pandemic hit, the World Economic Forum announced that the world is facing a reskilling emergency, and we need to reskill more than 1 billion people by 2030, which is a shocking statistic. The subsequent disruption caused by the pandemic only served to accelerate the use of technology and digitization, transforming how we work and learn. And for some, it was very positive. However, there's no way around the fact that digitalization, robotics, and AI will reduce demand for lesser skilled workers whilst increasing demand for higher skilled workers. As new technologies are rolled out, businesses will have to change the mix of skills required of their workforce. That, of course, leads to a skills mismatch and boosts income inequality, at least in the short term. And very often we see minorities and already disadvantaged groups, such as women and racial minorities, suffer first and suffer most. And the big question is whether new technologies will augment existing workers or replace them. And my guess is that it will be a bit of both. Education will be a key enabler to building the workforce of the future, whether we're talking about upskilling, reskilling, or completely retraining. But worryingly, educational inequity is widening, and the difference between the privileged and those most left behind is increasing. But to meet the shifting dynamics head on, it's essential to equip today's students and workers with the ability to adapt and be resilient in the face of ongoing change, to embrace lifelong learning to prepare themselves for jobs that may not even exist yet, and to put inclusion at the heart of our thinking as we make decisions for the future. Businesses like Deloitte that have the talented professionals, resources, and reach to make an impact must do more to ensure that low-skilled workers do not get left behind. And through World Class, Deloitte is committed to expanding opportunities for 100 million people by 2030. helping them to fulfill their aspirations and to meet current and future job demands. And we're doing this by empowering people through education, skills development, and access to opportunity. For example, Deloitte people are empowering refugees in Switzerland to find jobs and stability. And we're working with world tech makers to address the digital skills gap in Colombia through coding and technology boot camps. So as you can see, the private sector can play a key role in providing access to education to create opportunity. And I think we have a moral obligation to do it.
Thank you, Mrs. Thorne. Thanks, so interesting. Mr. Zhao, as emerging technologies such as 5G, for example, AI, we've just heard, and the Internet of Things go mainstream, what can we do to ensure the benefits of these new technologies and make sure they are going to be distributed fairly and equal to everyone? You have 3 minutes reply.
Yeah, thank you very much. These new technologies are really important for our future. And we are working with our partners to promote, implementing of these new technologies, 5G, AI, Internet of Things, cloud computing, blockchain, all these new technologies. And in my speech over the last 1.5 years, I firmly believe that the next decade is our 5G decade, because that if we don't have 5G, it's not that we were very unfortunate to really go to 2030 to reach the goal that SDG will be achieved. So that is a challenge to us, and I'm very pleased to see that almost everywhere they promote these new technologies in the media, in the public. So that is very good. And of course, to have these technologies be really beneficial to people, we need infrastructure to introduce this one. And for this infrastructure, we need investment. And if we, really do our job correctly, I put the 4 I's: infrastructure, investment, innovation, and inclusiveness. That infrastructure means to bring new technologies to our stage. Infrastructure means we connect those not connected yet by extending infrastructure to reach them. So that is a huge challenge, and we need investment. We have to create a good environment to get the investment, and then innovation is absolutely important. Innovation not only in technologies, 5G, we have to. People already talked about 6G. That all this will be advanced. But anyhow, here is not only innovation of technology, but also innovation of our policy. That to have a good policy to create good environment, and innovation also not only from big guys, from SMEs. We have a lot of marvelous ideas, and then inclusiveness means we don't leave anybody behind. So that is my priority and my message, that I would encourage everybody to come together to work on the ICT development, so that ICT will be really beneficial to everybody.
Thank you so much. And as far as I'm understanding, there is also still with us Mr. Cerf, right? Mr. Cerf, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and I appreciate an opportunity to make a comment based on the very good remarks coming from Hulan Zhao and Sharon Thorne. The first one is that at Google, we recognized very quickly that people needed to learn new things in order to have new jobs. And so we have a major program called Grow with Google. We make use of the internet in order to do training so people can be prepared for the new jobs that are coming. And as Ms. Thorne pointed out, some of them we don't even know what they're going to be yet. So people have to learn how to learn. They have to learn to want to learn in order to be prepared for the future. But the second thing I wanted to reinforce is what Hulan Zhao was saying about investment. I believe governments need to recognize that they have to invest government support and funding for infrastructure. They do this for roads, they do this for the power generation and distribution systems, for telecommunications. We need to see a combination of private sector and government investment in order to ensure that the infrastructure is in place so that people can in fact get access to affordable internet so they can use it in order to learn the new jobs or learn the new skills that they need for the jobs that are coming. And so I hope you can see from all of the remarks that there is a big opportunity here to create a better world for everyone if we just pay close attention to getting the infrastructure in place with the right policy rules to support it.
Thank you, and thanks also for staying with us for a longer time that previously decided. Thank you so much, Mr. Cerf. Thanks.
It's a pleasure.
And thanks also to my, thanks. And thanks also to my guests. Thank you so much. To Sharon Thorne and to Mr. Hulin Zhao. Thank you to both of you. And thanks, Mrs. Noer. Such an interesting comment from you. Thank you. And now, let me call on stage the Executive Vice President and Director of ISPI, Paolo Magri. And I go. I leave you the stage.
Thank you. We now have the great pleasure and honor to have with us Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, former President of Chile, actually twice President of Chile in 2006 and 2014. High Commissioner, welcome and thanks for being with us. We are really happy to have the opportunity to listen to your comments in this summit in which we are trying to share ideas for the G20, for the Italian G20 presidency. In the previous panel, Sharon Thorne, chair of Deloitte Global Board, underlined how inequalities have been on the rise for decades and recently. And on top of that, during the pandemic, also a surge in poverty has been faced. What has been the impact of this on the respect and promotion of human rights, particularly in countries which are more vulnerable, marked with political or economical instability?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having this possibility, for inviting me to share my views on the importance of delivering on people, planet, and prosperity. For people and planets to prosper, it's important to turn the tide on poverty and inequality everywhere. I think everybody can recognize and understand that inequalities existed before the pandemic, but what the pandemic has done is to lay bare inequalities and, on the other hand, to aggravate them and exacerbate them. Pre-existing, intersecting structural discrimination and deep-rooted inequalities within countries and between them as well. Inequalities are manifesting themselves in different forms, in multiple forms, such as unequal access without discrimination to social protection, healthcare, safe water, basic sanitation, or education. While the world top billionaires increased their wealth by 25% since the COVID-19 outbreak, over 100 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty, and more than 270 million people are at risk of starvation. Resource-dependent LDCs, least developed countries, have been severely affected by commodity price shocks and loss of export, investment, and remittances, along with a rapid plummet in tourism. And perhaps the most striking inequality of our times, vaccine nationalism, whereby high-income countries have administered 61 times more doses per inhabitant than low-income countries, according to WHO, and some low and low-middle-income countries have vaccinated less than 1% of their population. So all these inequalities hamper people's in the full enjoyment of the human rights, especially their economic, social, and cultural rights, and the right to development. For all of these reasons that we said, the pandemic, yes, it is a health crisis. It has become, due to the consequences, also an economic and social crisis, but also as well an human rights crisis. So to recover from the most wide-reaching and severe cascade of human rights setbacks in our lifetimes, And from spiraling inequalities, we need a life-changing vision and concerted action to put that vision into action. So we need to achieve what we have called in the UN a renewed social contract anchored in human rights, as the Secretary General has made as a centerpiece of its new report, important report, that our common agenda. And this effort requires the greater international solidarity encapsulated in the Declaration of the Right to Development. So adopting expansive economic and fiscal policies and expanding social expenditure is the right thing to do at times of crisis. High-income countries are investing nearly 28% of their gross domestic product into the economic recovery. For even in middle-income countries, that numbers falls to 6.5%, and it plummets to 1.8% when we are thinking of least developed countries. So more needs to be done, including debt relief to afford least developed countries and small islands, developing states, the necessary, if I would say, fiscal state that permits them to adopt counter-cyclical measures. So while increased international solidarity is essential to reduce inequalities, even in countries with limited fiscal space, fighting corruption, reallocating resources, and rethinking taxation can help to maximize resources for advancing a human rights economy. And I think economy must be geared to deliver access to universal health care, social protection, quality education, clean water, housing, all of which are not ordinary services with a market set price tag, but fundamental human rights. So states therefore need to urgently increase social spending in the legal human rights commitments they made to secure access to affordable quality service for all, including the poorest and furthest behind. But let me say a couple of things on this. The virus, the epidemic has affected everyone on health issues, but also on other issues. But there are certain groups that have been particularly affected, disproportionately affected. And those are groups that they're not inherently more vulnerable to the virus. It's because they've been discriminated and marginalized for decades, for many, many years. And we're talking about women and girls, we're talking about older people, we're talking about people living with disabilities, indigenous people, we're talking about rural people, poor people, people from the LGBTIQ plus community, people on the move, I mean, migrants, refugees, IDPs, and so on. So we need to, when we're thinking on the response and the recovery, we need to think on how we do not leave those people furthest behind if we don't include it in the policies, if we don't look at this intersectionality of vulnerabilities. So they need to be, these are people who are suffering from structural discrimination and inequalities and need to be at the center of these efforts. We cannot fix what we do not see, so we need to invest in human rights impact assessment and disaggregated data and community-led, I would say, data to design policies that effectively respond to the needs of marginalized groups. Because one thing that I can tell you is that women and girls' rights have been so disproportionately affected. So that is one area we need to look much more. So on the other hand, participation is key. All policymaking should be grounded in meaningful participation, social dialogue, transparency, and accountability. States need to foster civil society and civic space, including civic space online. But also have to say that we have seen that before the COVID-19, the normality that we had at that time was not the normality that people wanted. We had 80 countries in the world in 2019 with the people on the streets protesting against the political system or against the economic system on the lack of well-being. So I think we don't need to go back to that normality. We cannot go back to that normality. We have to build back better. We have to do much better. And in that sense, I think on one hand, the rhetoric is changing. Increasingly is being recognized. The need for a deep-seated change is not happening yet. So I think it's so important that these conversations could lead to an important and real reflection that would lead to a transformative change that really will mean that people's lives are improved and all human rights are fully enjoyed by the peoples of the world.
That's our hope, of course, not only to debate and discuss and meditate, but to turn some of the ideas into action soon. You mentioned women and vulnerable groups several times in your first answer. And there is one country whose women and vulnerable groups have attracted attention and concern. The country is Afghanistan. Afghanistan back to square one. What can and what should the international community do to protect these people inside and outside Afghanistan?
Well, I would like to think that we're not on square one, and let me explain why. It might happen at the last moment that we will be in square one, but I think we're not in the same position than 20 years ago. Because there has been gains in Afghanistan in terms of human rights, in terms of the capacity and agency of women and girls and the Afghan civil society that had emerged over the past 2 decades. Sustaining girls' education beyond the primary level and pathways for women to continue careers should be the highest priority. So many countries did a commendable job evacuating human rights and women's rights defenders in urgent need for protection, and we need to support the neighboring countries sheltering a large number of Afghan refugees. But beyond evacuation, we need to look for strategies that can rebuild, if I may say, and empower an Afghan civil society that represents hope for a better future. Some of this will need to happen outside the country, helping activists and journalists find their feet and develop the work remotely. But ultimately, we need to find ways to reach and sustain a civil society within Afghanistan that can begin to bring change even in the hardest of hearts one finds in the Taliban. So however difficult it looks, the international community can try to influence Afghanistan's development towards a peaceful and pluralistic society that respects human rights for all. I'm not saying it's easy, I'm not saying it will be successful, but we need to try to think on strategies that could also lead to that. As Taliban looks for international recognition, there is an opportunity for us to nudge them towards accepting and adhering to core global values such as international human rights standards. I'm not saying easy, again, I want to say. We need to focus on areas that are in everyone's interest, such as what is needed for economic development and social cohesion, for which the education and empowerment of women is essential. We need to find new ways to deliver social protection to ensure the delivery to at least essential basic levels of economic, social, and cultural rights. I mean, we are really, really concerned, of course, on women and girls' rights, because we know, and we have said that these are red lines, that girls should be ensured to be able to have secondary education. And this is something is not ensured yet, it's not guaranteed yet. And these girls are going to primary school in many parts of Afghanistan, but not yet to secondary education. And of course, the university not yet either, because they have said they have to have female teachers, and many female teachers have fled out of Afghanistan. So, but we also have this huge problem that is the dire economic, social, and humanitarian crisis and situation. It's really, really terrible. And now the winter is coming. The other day, one of our colleagues who were there was telling us how mothers will bring children to the hospitals, not because they were sick, it's because they didn't have anything to eat for a week. So really, I think we need to look at the whole dimension, what this means, and to be able to identify how we can improve human rights in the whole dimension in Afghanistan. So we need to find new ways to deliver social protection to ensure the delivery of these essential basic levels of economic, social, and cultural rights, mitigating the negative impacts of unemployment and creating access to further education. But above all, if I would say, we must sustain the interest and solidarity of the international community beyond this current crisis. If we lose interest in the future of Afghans and support to the Afghan civil society, then I'm afraid that the narrow opportunity that we have that is still remaining will be lost. So in addition, as we draw our roadmap ahead in the current challenges, all aid must include a human rights impact assessment. Human rights metrics should be the metrics of success of all provided assistance, and human rights risk must be identified and mitigated aid is to ensure that Afghans particularly the vulnerable, do not slide back into poverty. Me and myself as a High Commissioner of Human Rights and of an office will be continually monitoring and stepping out every time it's needed for the right of women and girls and for the human rights of the Afghan people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Having you in that position, in that role, reassure us. We know how you will be monitoring all the evolution. Thanks for being with us and best wishes for your job, for your role, and for the role of the High Commission. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor back to Mariangela, who is here, and to Professor Boeri for the next panel.
Thank you. Very interesting interview. Professor Tito Boeri is here with me. Welcome. And in this sixth panel, we will talk about poverty and inequalities turning the tide. So the very first video we will show you is about the key policy recommendations from a T20 task force on social cohesion and on poverty. Let's hear that.
Agenda 2030 is at the crossroad of several policy areas. Since 2015, it has indicated the unsustainabilities of our world, of our model of consuming, of producing, of interacting with our planet. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic has certainly, on one side, hit dramatically and slowed down the progress towards the implementation of SDGs. But on the other side, it has also confirmed the importance of the implementation of Agenda 2030 and of SDGs, all SDGs, if we want really to build back better, a more sustainable world for everybody. G20 can lead by example. For example, G20 members can present and track and assess their SDG implementation plan, linking to the utilization of the additional resources which are liberated. Then there are several sectorial policy recommendations. The first is to link, obviously, additional resources which are liberated by initiative on debt or initiative like the one decided by IMF on the additional SDRs to the realization of SDGs and to use these resources as innovatively as possible and as close as possible to the level of implementation. Another sectorial recommendation is to set up a permanent joint thematic group on food. This could be composed by agriculture, finance, development, and health ministers. Last recommendation is to boost investment in science, technology, and innovation in low and middle income countries through establishing missions which are linked to SDGs implementation.
And now, Professor Boeri, I leave the floor to you because you are in conversation with the 2019 Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences, Esther Duflo. Welcome, Mrs. Duflo. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
Dear Esther, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and let me say that we hope to have you soon in presence in Italy. Far from being a great leveler, the pandemic has increased inequalities worldwide. According to the World Bank, extreme poverty has increased by about 100 million. The ILO estimates that some 150 million jobs were lost. And also the main social elevator, the education system, has suffered a lot. The estimate is about 1.5 trillion hours of school being lost. And above all, the current recovery does not seem to be improving the situation. Actually, it may make the situation even worse, because yesterday we learned from the managing director of the IMF, that we are experiencing a great divergence in economic performance, and that is making even worse the situation in the developing world, with an increase in food prices and also lagging behind in growth. So beyond the vaccination campaign, the acceleration of the vaccination campaign in developing world, what do you think can be done to tackle this emergency, this social emergency? You know, one of the proposals that we developed in the task force I had the honor to co-chair was the introduction of a global universal basic income or citizenship income scheme for developing countries. So an unconditional cash transfer to be provided and funded largely by G20 countries. What do you think about this proposal? Is it feasible? Is it something that is desirable at this stage?
Yes, so first of all, I should say that I think the richer world has missed a massive opportunity to show a modicum of sense that there is a common planet in this pandemic in at least two circumstances, in at least two occasions. One is towards the beginning of the pandemic when the rich world started to borrow massive amounts of money in order to sustain their own economy. Trillions of dollars, you know, with up to 20% of GDP and fiscal stimulus measures in the rich countries, but at the same time did not see it fit to find a little bit of money to cover something at least similar in the poorest country, such that the poorest country spent about 2% in fiscal stimulus measures during the pandemic. And that is kind of the root of the divergence that we are observing today. Because the pandemic itself didn't strike disproportionately the poor countries at the beginning. In fact, anything but they had to adopt, because we didn't know what was going on, the similar kind of lockdown measure. And unlike the rich countries, they were unable to protect their citizens, which has started, you know, a loop of poverty traps. One of them is the one you mentioned, which is the education gap, which even today is not really in process of being solved. As of today, there are still 130 million kids around the world who are not in school because of the pandemic. Most of the schools in India are yet to reopen after so many months. And this is something that very early in the pandemic, something like in May, we were calling with Abhijit Banerjee for a Marshall Plan towards the developing countries. And no one paid attention. And I was like, yes, this is, you know, the rich countries are very busy with their own problems. That's not the right time. But then we renewed this appeal later around the G7 meeting in the UK. And again, nothing happened. And even now, you know, the IMF leader goes around trying to make a similar request, and again, nothing happens. And this is quite remarkable to me, that we didn't see fit to show such basic solidarity, which would have cost almost nothing compared to what we were spending on ourselves. The second, of course, is vaccination. I know that this is not what you want to talk about, but it's worth mentioning. This would have been easy. This would have been cheap. The IMF estimates $50 billion. That we couldn't find this $50 billion, and that to these days we are unable to do that. Means that now we have the added problem that the pandemic itself is going to have a disproportionate health impact in the poor countries, which is going to make it harder for them to restart their economy. So now we are on top of what we had before, which is we didn't have the same amount of fundings to sustain the economy. We have the pandemic. Now coming back to your proposal, yes, I think it is feasible. In fact, what we were recommending in our book, which came out in the US in 2019, just before the pandemic, was universal, very basic income towards the poor countries, which would have been, and very similar to your proposal, a very small income sufficient to starvation, perhaps available, when people request it. So this, which would make it considerably cheaper if you just have a small request mechanism that you have to do to make sure that people access it when they need it. And it's always available in case of crisis, personal or global. The pandemic showed that having those systems in place ready, having the pipes in place with such a system ready would have been tremendously helpful. Because one of the things that happened, even for countries which technically would have had the money to help their citizens during the lockdowns, is that they didn't have the ways to do it. Like in India, for example, the organization of the redistribution was completely messy. And that's why people, migrant workers had to go home to access their programs, because the only way that the government could do it is tied to your home address. Well, if there had been a universal very basic income in place, connected to people's bank accounts or connected to people's cell phones, which many people have, for example, in Africa, then they would have been able to kind of ramp it up. Once you have the pipe in place, when you have a crisis, you can just put a bit more water into these pipes and help the economy continue to flow. So I think this is an excellent idea. I think it is feasible. I think it can. I have no hope that the rich countries would ever want to pay for it. But if they would, be my guest, that would be fantastic. Even if they wouldn't, I think we still need to do it, because then the poor countries would actually be able to finance a good part of it from their own tax revenues as they finance most of their social programs today, as long as it is kept small and available in crisis periods.
So even if I don't want to pay for it, we can make them to pay for it. Another proposal developed by our task force is introducing a tax on the stock market capitalization of publicly listed companies in the G20 country. This proposal has been in particular developed by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman. They propose to introduce a tax of about 0.2%, so it seemed to be a relatively modest tax, but would still raise some 200 billion that could be used also to fund such a universal basic income scheme. What do you think about this additional proposal of our task force?
I think it's a great idea, and I think, I always want to think of the glass being as half full, and I think in a way this is probably a good moment for such a proposal, because one of the, when you try to convince either citizens or their leaders that we need to show a bit more generosity towards the poor countries, there is always the answer is, oh, the money is not going to be used effectively, and there is corruption and so on and so forth. But I think now, especially with the pandemic, people realize that it is actually completely technologically feasible to have a system of cash transfer that is directly going to people's pockets, that those systems are fairly robust. A country like Togo, which is a very small country, managed to put it together for their citizens within weeks of the pandemic started. And Togo is one place where lockdowns were put in place regularly when they needed them, and where in fact the health burden of the pandemic was much less, as well as the economic burden. So if Togo can do it, Togo is now in a position to expand it in the rest of the region with a system that is effective, that is efficient. Once it is expanded to the rest of the region from Togo, I think it would be a powerful example that, look, the way to spend this money that Saez and Zuckman wants to raise is there. And it is a way that is effective, that is pretty much corruption-proof, that has shown in multiple studies to provide immediate benefit to the people in period of crisis. So let's just go and do it. So there might be, everything is in place for at least the rhetorical objection to such a proposal to be removed. Now, it's not sufficient because, going back to vaccination, all the rhetorical objections to vaccinating the world are removed. Everybody agrees it's a good idea. And for a reason that I still don't understand, that doesn't seem to be possible. So here as well, we are going to find something. Something's going to happen. Very serious people are going to stand in the way, or some political obstructionists of some kind of the other. But, there is at least a glimmer of hope that it is feasible, because the money is not that much. the system can be put in place. We can have convincing use cases and move forward from there. So I have some hope that it could get done.
Thank you so much, Esther.
Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you, Mrs. Duflo, Professor Duflo. Thanks. Maybe she can stay with us for a little bit longer, but meanwhile, a new pattern also for the working environment is put in place after the pandemic with this remote working. It's going to be like the new normal, or it's going to change a little bit? It's going to be managed in a different way? What do you think?
I don't think it's going to be a new normal. Certainly, remote working, as I would call it, has increased in all countries. You know, it was about 10% of the workforce involved before the pandemic, and it rose about 40, 50% during the crisis. Nowadays it's going down, and more work is done in presence. Still, I think we are not going to the level that were prevailing before. As many firms also coming out of a crisis being highly indebted are trying to cut on fixed costs. So I think we are going to move to an hybrid condition in which workers will be in presence for 3 days a week and 2 days at home or something like that. And this creates a number of opportunities as well as problems. The opportunities are that we are going to reduce somewhat the traffic and related pollution, reducing work injuries that often takes place in the transit from home to work. Also, greater well-being, possibly for people being more able to manage their time. But at the same time, there are issues. This is a highly unregulated area involving many also cross-border flows, because remote working can be done everywhere. And also, I think, and this is my main concern, it could increase inequalities and create even more barriers to social mobility, because you add the new dimension of inequality, notably housing inequality, to working inequality. You know, people living in poor residential environment will find it very hard to cope with this. People having poor internet connection will also be penalized with respect to other workers. So that's something we really have to deal with. And unfortunately, the problem is that we don't have a good monitoring system. There is no survey in countries, you know, OECD countries, tracking at the same time working conditions, salary, wages, careers of workers, and housing conditions. So we need to know more about this.
It's going to be evolving into something else, and we still have to know how. Let me start the conversation and the panel here with Karim El Ainaoui, President, Policy Center for the New South in Morocco, Gabriela Bucha, Executive Director for Oxfam International, welcome, and Guntram Wolf, Director of Bruegel in Belgium. Thank you to the three of you for being with us today. Can you hear me well, right? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. El Ainaoui, I start with you. The pandemic has had this strong impact on the global economy. Hitting in particular, we have just seen that, the developing countries. In your view, what is the recipe for the global South to build economic resilience? You have 4 minutes for your reply.
Well, thank you. Nice to be with you. I cannot give you a recipe in 4 minutes, and even if you gave me hours, what I can give you is how sort of we reacted here in Africa, in Morocco, and other countries that I follow. Basically, the crisis showed the importance of to have a strong state in a positive sense, not an authoritarian state, but an organized state, a social state, able to deliver services and protection for its own population. So it was mentioned by Ms. Duflo earlier on. She gave the example of Togo. So it's a matter also of organization, of how you operate logistics, how you you're able to bring services to the population, and particularly the poor portion of your population. So I think we are on for a sort of the state is back in a way. And this is a demand from population. This is not something that is superimposed. Let's not forget that the poor are sort of, bearing the stronger part of the adjustment of mistakes in policies, inefficiency in policies, done by governments. They're not a symmetrical impact on population, so the poor are more affected. So it is a good case to correct with pro-poor policies, and that are sort of tailored for you to have, social cohesion. Social cohesion is a peaceful society with a sense of fairness, a sense of justice, which we're all sort of attached to as human beings, without any sort of ideological component. And it's not easy to put in practice. We need to acknowledge that it's complex. Often policies do not acknowledge up front that it is complex. Academics may, but when it comes to delivering on the ground, often we have very simple mechanisms that just fail, and this links back to the social cohesion where you are mentioning. So that's what I mean. Those countries need to work on the efficiency of the state, their fairness, their sort of transparency and governance, and capacity to be for the population to assess their effectiveness. So it has also, a flavor of course, democracy and a more open society, and which remains, I think, something even more important today.
Thank you. I agree with you. Mrs. Bucher, what about, 2030 will be a milestone for the global development agenda. As far as the SDGs are concerned, are you confident the objectives will going to be reached?
Thank you, and thank you very much for having Oxfam here at this important event. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, so yes, I'm also very pleased that we're focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals, their roadmap for humanity, and all our governments and every G20 government has signed up to them, and they represent our collective hope. But the reality is that we were far off track before the pandemic struck, and now we're mostly free-falling backwards. So the status of SDG 1, hundreds of millions pushed into poverty. SDG 2, unfortunately, 11 lives every minute likely being lost to hunger. And on SDG 4 and 5, 20 million girls may never return to school. And we can go on. But yet the challenge facing the SDGs is not a lack of resources. And I think Professor Duflo was saying how some of these solutions are affordable. It's not a lack of talent, because actually we have plenty of talent, plenty of imagination right across the world. The challenge is that our economic rules are designed to serve the interest of a tiny few at the expense of opportunities for so many. So this is what SDG 10 is all about. SDG 10 is about reducing inequality, and it is critical in making progress across all goals. But as we have been hearing, inequality is getting even more extreme. We know a billionaire recently burned $5 billion on a joyride to space, but the whole world struggled to find $5 billion to fund education for those millions of kids that are most at risk of being left behind. And we know the global economy has put tens of billions of dollars into the profits, into the vaccine monopoly owners, while billions of people are being denied access to a vaccine. So we do think we have to come together to do better. And we know that the G20 is our best chance at leadership on the global stage to get this right. If we were to assess the performance of the G20 amid the biggest crisis in a generation, at a time in which millions of lives have been lost, what would we say? Perhaps we would say what has been done is insufficient. We value the progress, for example, on the issuance of SDRs, but a number of the issues that we are discussing today, we need to really see much more than we have up to now. The good news is that G20 can change this, and they have a chance to show They did what was necessary in Rome on October 20th. The single most important step at the G20 must be to listen to their own members, South Africa, Indonesia, India, and really call for the intellectual property rules on COVID-19 vaccines to be lifted at the WTO and for technology to be transferred to the World Health Organization. We need to see an end to the opposition of Germany and the UK to the waiver and provide the turning point to the pandemic that saves millions of lives and gives a chance to address this inequality that we've talked about. That's how we unlock vaccine supplies across the globe and get the economy running again. That's the first step, but not the only step. The G20 has an immensely historic decision to make on the global corporate tax deal. The deal we currently have, the version we have as proposed by the G7, is frankly being seized by a handful of rich nations. Instead, we need a deal with at least a 25% minimum corporate tax rate as proposed by tax experts, so that we can invest in schools, in nurses, in transforming people's lives and achieving the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Booker. You touched a lot of points, and I so agree with you with so many points you've touched. Very important to say that. Mr. Wolf, a major achievement of Italy in the recent G20 was like this establishment of a global minimum tax. Well, it's already in theory. We have to see that in practice still. Do you think with taxation, it's possible to use taxation like sort of a leverage in order to do more on the inequalities front?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I was planning to say a few words following up on what Esther Duflo was talking about, namely the question of pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, where, frankly speaking, I quite share Esther's pessimism or I would say analytical description of reality. And where I wanted to put the focus on the future. In fact, we know that in the current pandemic, the rich world missed a huge opportunity to accelerate the vaccination of the world and to ensure that vaccines become widely available and quickly. I think the situation will probably improve in the next half year, because now the global capacity to produce significant amounts of vaccines is there. So there will be some improvement, but it comes quite late. Now, what I'm wondering is, what do we do with the next pandemic? And, I had the pleasure to work for a G20 panel that reported to the G20 finance ministers early July of this year, the high-level independent panel on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And, the basic argument we are making is that the likelihood of pandemics is actually increasing. It's not decreasing, it's increasing. It's increasing because of a loss of biodiversity, because of climate change, because of increasing closeness between humans and nature due to the loss of major areas of natural habitat. So this likelihood is increasing, and frankly speaking, it is irresponsible not to invest in pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And we computed estimates of what it would take to significantly reduce the probability of such pandemics reoccurring. And it turns out the numbers are actually very small. The world might need something in the sort of below 15 billion US dollars per year. 15 billion US dollars is probably the best public investment with the highest return that exists at the moment. You would invest a double-digit billion number in US dollars, and the return you receive from that is in the hundreds, not only in the hundreds of billions, but in the 100 times the investment. So meaning you will literally save trillions of US dollars. So it is actually irrational not to do these kind of investments. It's not just morally unfair and morally unacceptable. It is actually economically irrational not to invest it. And that leaves us with a puzzle. I have to say, this discussion is, of course, still ongoing. The G20 countries are discussing and want to raise some money, but the first signals we are getting from these ongoing political discussions is that we probably will fall short of what is needed in pandemic prevention for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And I think this really bodes well, bodes badly for providing global public goods in general. I mean, this is really an easy global public good to provide. I mean, it takes double-digit billions. It's very cheap, this global public good. And that contrasts very much with, I would say, climate change, where providing climate change is actually very difficult because it costs a lot of money to do the necessary investments, etc., etc. So I can understand why countries are free riding on climate change issues. I mean, I don't approve it, but I can understand it. But I can't really understand why the world is not managing to mobilize the 10 to 15 billion that we estimate will be needed to reduce the likelihood of such pandemics in the future.
Perfect. Mr. Wolf, you have used already 4 minutes to comment on Esther Duflo. If you want, you can use 3 minutes to answer my question about taxation.
Oh, okay. So
it's all right. Yeah. Go on.
I'm happy to talk about many different issues. So I can, of course, also talk about the taxation issue.
Thank you.
I mean, look, my take on this is that we are way behind where we should be on ensuring that tax avoidance really gets addressed, and companies as well as individuals pay their fair share of taxes. And if you look at I mean, the release of, it was this week, I think, of the Pandora Papers. I mean, it's just a totally unacceptable system where just way too many rich individuals evade proper taxation, and so this needs to be addressed. And I personally think it's a huge success if the OECD G20 processes lead to a step forward, and we ensure that there's a corporate minimum tax around the world. Now, this deal isn't closed yet, right? I mean, it's still ongoing, the negotiations, but I understand that countries like such as Ireland are now ready to move up their corporate tax to 15%, given where we are and where the pressure is on. So that would be a success, definitely. But in a sense, I do think there is an issue that goes beyond the corporate side. It's also some of the individuals that evade taxes, where there are still some tax havens, and definitely in a system where the share of capital income is actually increasing. It is very important that the taxation base doesn't only rest on value-added taxes and labor taxes. I mean, and if you look at the trends, I mean, what you see in many European countries, for example, is you see a fairly stable share of capital income tax, but the capital income as a share of value-added has actually been increasing, meaning effectively the average taxation of the corporate sector of capital income has fallen. So I think there is a need to rebalance that, and I'm very happy if some progress is being made on this. But I think this will be a continued negotiation and discussion.
Thank you. Mrs. Bucher, you also have 3 minutes for this reply. You said before, G20 meeting in Rome is critical, is very important. What do you think the role of G20 should be in order to finance policies, for example, to reduce inequality?
Yes, thank you. So as was said, we need to increase the fiscal space so that countries are able to invest in the policies that are going to make any difference on people's lives and, of course, achieve the SDGs. So the corporate tax deal that is for discussion in Rome is this one of these key elements. And at the moment, the version that we have is not really an overhaul as we would like it to be, and it's not the historic deal that we could have hoped for. Only 100 corporations will be covered, while the financial sector is exempted from the deal. And most shockingly, 2/3 of all the revenue would be granted to mainly G7 and EU nations. So the poorest countries, despite being key markets in which sales are made for corporations, and despite being home to 1/3 or more than 1/3 of the world's population, will get less than 3% of these revenues as a result of the way the deal is being discussed. And we also need to see a change to that minimum corporate tax rate. So my predecessor was speaking of Ireland going up to 15%. 15% is a bare minimum, and it's basically in line with tax havens such as Singapore. So it would be normalizing that approach. We need a minimum of 25%, and as we know, after the Second World War, which was a similar massive shock to the system, in the United States, we had rates of over 40 to 50% corporate tax rates that stayed on for some time, because that was required in terms of investment. So if we reach 25% at this time, that would raise nearly 17 billion more per year for the world's poorest countries than a 15% rate. And imagine what that would mean in terms of investment for a woman, a street seller in Uganda, a nurse in Nepal, small businesses. So that is what many developing countries and G20 countries such as Argentina are calling for. But even that would only be a start. And that was being mentioned before, the Pandora Papers demonstrate the enormous amount of tax avoidance. And that's where the money is flowing around in the darkness of the world's tax havens. And that's where we're missing all our hospitals, all the payments for teachers, for firefighters, for public servants. So we can no longer, nobody can say that there is no money. The money is there, it's just in the wrong places. So we have an opportunity at G20 to really work on that corporate tax deal and really make it an end of tax havens. And also on the G20 agenda is, of course, the issue of special drawing rights, which is important, as I mentioned before, another element of the fiscal space that is required. At the moment, of course, of the 650 billion, 400 billion would be going to rich countries because of the way the system is allocated in terms of each member country's quota in the IMF. So Italy and Tanzania may have the same size population, but Italy gets nearly 40 times more, or $20 billion more than Tanzania. So we need to see a significant portion, at least $100 billion of SDRs redirected to where they're most needed, to low and middle-income countries. And we need to ensure that debt and conditionality free, because that would mean that they would actually be able to be used properly. France recently committed 20% of its SDRs, around $5.5 billion, to Africa. And we think this is a very positive step that shows that it can be done. And the G20, we feel, must do its part to secure strong and fair, channeling ambition from other wealthy countries and get this to be the norm. Thank you.
Thanks, Mrs. Bucher. And Mr. Elenawi, what about empowering women? Because I have such a privileged panel to interview. I like to have your view also on this. Coming here, I read a statistic in the stock exchange in London. There are more CEOs named Peter than CEO who are women. So it was like, my God. And in Italy too. I mean, more CEOs named Carlo in Italian stock exchange than CEO who are women. But women are important to boost equitable growth, especially in Africa, in Afghanistan, in many places in the world. What can we say about that in reducing this gender gap? You have to put your mic on.
Yeah, what I hear the picture you're describing, which is what we have today. in many places. What I can tell you is that, as I'm also a dean at the university, is that we have 70% of our students here in Morocco are women. For a reason we don't understand very well, would be maybe too long to explain here. In many higher education, it's about 70 to 75% women. So this will bring about transformational change in the upcoming generation. I can be optimistic on this basis. But again, I think, and it's like the discussion I was listening, you just had before. There's politics. I mean, economists, we tend to think in a sort of equilibria, so framework and apolitical systems. Politics is back. Geopolitics is back. I think what we lived, since the 90s is a parenthesis. So aid, the notion that there are rich countries and poor countries, I don't think will be as relevant as we may think. There's rivalry. Countries will be invited to take sides. You can all feel that. So going back to that, women also is a political matter, is an institutional matter. So I think we can only be very concrete on those things. It's not about proclamation. It's about institutions. It's about objective. It's about measuring. It's about progress. It's about, budgets. It's about investing for it to transform. I can give you a conundrum here in Morocco, for instance. With urbanization, we have lower participation of women to the labor market. You thought that urbanization is education, is a participation to the labor market. We've observed, over the past 15 years that women labor participation rates have declined. There are explanations, reservation wage, why women would stay home, etc. But this is a worrisome trend. So I think education and institutions and having concrete policy with measurement and having open debates again to show up trade-offs between policies and choices, and that's what we do in think tanks, in academia, is to show options, and I think not to go also to way beyond what we are able to do, which is goals, has to do with politics. And I think one lesson of this COVID crisis is that also the role of science, the nexus, academia, science, policies, and population, is something very complex. We've seen it, over the past couple of years. So I think in academia, think tanks and institutions of this nature, we need to see how we can improve the functioning of this very complex nexus for to contribute to show options again of policies, and to show inconsistency, to show sort of crazy situation like Guntram was describing. It doesn't make sense because it goes in no one's pocket, Guntram. It's not, you don't have an identified investors that will have returns. Maybe we need to innovate. It could be it could be sort of financialized, where the financial sector invests in this sort of global goods with the return. So I think we have a problem with finance also. We have not talked about that, but that creates many risks where the poor, in fact, are bearing the brunt of their crisis in the financial sector. And maybe my last word is that we never really recovered, in fact, from the financial crisis, and until this crisis, we have macroeconomic disequilibrium, we have issues of rich versus poor, just to summarize, etc. So the institutions are sort of lagging behind what's happening in reality. And the same to your question with women. I think this is lots of lip service. I mean, there's progress. Like in Morocco, we have imposed quota for women in the parliament. I mentioned in university where it's open, no barriers to entry, and then you see women entering. There's this conundrum with the labor market. So So it's not enough just to have commitments to raise awareness, and I don't think it's good, but it's way not enough. And again, this is a long fight. I don't think this is something will happen overnight. This is a fight. This is something we need to work on.
Mrs. Booker, can I have also your opinion on this issue about empowering women?
So maybe I would say that we need systemic solutions. So I think the SDGs are part of the answer. So instead of focusing on GDP, we need to focus on people's lives. And one element that is outside of GDP calculations that is fundamental and central to women's lives is the care economy. So making sure that that is central in public policy is important, because there are all sorts of barriers for women's participation and care burdens, and the valorization of care is a big important part of it. And another that I would say Michelle Bachelet was mentioning earlier is that when we think of investments, we must absolutely think about the intersectionality of identities and how different groups of people are differently impacted by policy, and to make sure that we have impact assessments and disaggregated data, and that we're really focusing on achieving results for those who have traditionally been left out of investments. So for women's participation in the economy and for women's participation in public life, we need to definitely focus initially also on girls and girls' education. And as I was saying in my initial answer, it's extremely concerning that now with the pandemic impact on education, there's a disproportionate effect on girls' education. And that is concerning now for those girls' lives now, but also for their future and their potential to participate in the economy in the future, and therefore for our development in general and long-term achievement of goals. Yeah. So it's about making investments now on girls, on adolescents, and making sure the care economy is part of the equation when we think of development.
I have a question from Ivana Zacharias from Suma in Chile to Mr. Wolf. Ivana writes, many leaders have suggested the implementation of inheritance taxes and wealth taxes to deal with the wide inequality that exists in many countries. However, when it comes to the poorest countries in the world, there might be a difficult solution to implement. What role for the G20 to advance universal solutions, Mr. Wolf? That's a question for you.
Well, I mean, inheritance taxes and wealth taxes, as you know, taxes are basically set at the national level, and different countries have different kinds of inheritance and wealth taxes. Belgium, for example, has a pretty significant inheritance tax. Other countries have lower inheritance taxes. Now, when it comes to low-income countries, I guess one key question is how can this inheritance tax, if a low-income country was to decide to implement an inheritance tax, how can it be actually implemented? I mean, because there comes back to the point we discussed before, which is all about tax evasion of those that are rich and can find different havens for parking their wealth. So you want to, I think you want to have a system where this kind of tax evasion and tax havens really gets reduced, and then it's also going to be easier to do the inheritance, to implement the inheritance taxes. Perhaps the last point on this, of course, what is also quite important, especially if you're a very low income country, is that the capital stock is being built up. Meaning, if you have a business that functions well, and at some stage that SME also goes to the children, you don't want to tax that so much that then this business gets destroyed. So there's also a very sort of careful balance you have to strike on exactly inheritance taxes and the buildup of capital, especially in low-income countries.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wolf, and thank you to all my guests. Karim El Ainawi, thank you so much, sorry for misspelling your name at first. Thank you, Mrs. Bucher, Gabriela Bucher, and Guntram Wolf. Thank you so much to the three of you. Thanks. Thanks to Professor Tito Boeri for being with me. Thank you so much, Professor. See you next time. On my show, maybe, at Sky.
Sure.
And now, I think I am joined by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Luigi Di Maio. Minister Di Maio, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I can hear you. It's okay.
Oh, okay, I can see you. Yeah, welcome. I don't know if you have listened to something before, but we have talked about migration, about poverty, about managing inequalities. I mean, we have talked about a lot of things. So from your point of view, what are the challenges ahead of us? Please.
Sorry, but it's very difficult to understand your words. We had an interference, I think.
It's all right. When you want, you can start.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests. I'm pleased to participate in the T20 Summit. I thank President Ambassador Massolo, Vice President Magri, and ISPI as National Coordinator and Chair of T20, Istituto Affari Internazionali as T20 Co-Chair, and Bocconi University as T20 Summit Co-Chair. Open and extensive dialogue between experts and policymakers is crucial to design successful policies. We therefore look forward to your conclusion with great interest in light of the coherence of the T20's work with the G20 agenda. A strong commitment to the launch of an effective multilateral action has inspired the entire work of Italy's G20 presidency. Our priorities, people, planet, and prosperity, were identified to address consistently global challenges through multilateral cooperation, taking into account the connections between the health and well-being of people, the planet, and of our societies. The COVID-19 pandemic has further highlighted the pressing need for the multilateral responses in an interdependent international system. In such juncture, the G20 has been faced with the urgency to address the health emergency and with the opportunity to build back better by accelerating the pace towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. We have built the 2021 G20 agenda on the assumption that the protection of global common goods is a shared responsibility and that the group should aim at finding effective answers to the cross-cutting challenges related to them, from health and food security to climate, sustainable development, and international trade. Allow me to outline the engagement of the Italian presidency and the results achieved in these areas, also in view of the forthcoming G20 summit. First, global health. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 emergency, Italy has promoted a coordinated international response by supporting the ACT Accelerator and its vaccines pillar, the COVAX, with 385 million euros and a pledge of 45 million vaccines doses to distribute through the facility. The Rome Declaration of Principles on Pandemic Preparedness, adopted at the Global Health Summit, marked an important step towards designing effective cooperative ways to defeat this pandemic and preventing the next one. Recognizing the connection between safeguarding health on a global scale and providing the means to fund efforts in this area, we have proposed the establishment of the Global Health and Finance Board to boost coordination between health and financial authorities. This forum will enhance global cooperation in the governance and financing of pandemics prevention, preparedness, and response. Second, food security. The risk for the pandemic to translate also into a food crisis of huge dimensions has led the G20 Foreign and Development Ministers to adopt the Matera Declaration while addressing in parallel the issues of a sustainable and inclusive development, especially in Africa. The Matera Declaration has paved the way to the Pre-Food Systems Summit in Rome and the Food Systems Summit in New York by renewing clearly the international commitment to reach zero hunger by 2030. Third, climate change and sustainable development. Maximizing synergies between our role as G20 presidency and co-chair of COP26, we have worked to strengthen the ambition of climate action with a special focus on climate-related impacts in Africa, which will be discussed at the ministerial event Encounters with Africa in Rome in the following days, and on the Nexus Climate Energy Transition. I also recall that the G20 ministerial meeting in Naples recognized for the first time within this forum the importance of not overcoming the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit set in the Paris Agreement. Fourth, international trade. A functioning international trade system is key to support a resilient and sustainable recovery, bringing prosperity to all. The G20 Trade and Investment Meeting, taking place in Sorrento on the 12th of October, aims to build political momentum around the reform of the World Trade Organization. The G20 will also explore ways to improve trade system resilience and seek consensus on the conclusion of the agreement on fisheries subsidies. In addition to cross-cutting global challenges in Italy's view, the G20 is also an inclusive platform for international coordination on emerging crises in support of the United Nations and other international organizations' efforts. For this reason, vis-à-vis the unfolding crisis in Afghanistan, Italy decided to organize on 22nd September a G20 foreign ministers meeting on Afghanistan, extended to international financial institutions and UN agencies in order to prepare the extraordinary G20 leaders meeting on this dossier convened by President of the Council of Ministers Draghi on 12 October. In a year of unprecedented trials for the international community, we have better understood the course on non-cooperative approaches. Italy's G20 presidency considers as part of its legacy an increased global awareness of the capacity of the G20 to be a key actor of a network result-oriented and inclusive multilateralism. The G20 has a role to play in reforming global governance, promoting coordination and synergies among international organizations, and availing itself of the contribution of all social actors. I am confident that discussions within the T20 will continue to support this vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Di Maio, for joining us, and good luck for the upcoming G20. Do a good job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good
Thanks.
luck to you.
Bye. Okay, un applause, yes. And now it's a time for another conversation. She's a virologist, an author, a professor at the University of Florida, and director of UF One Health Center. Now is the time for welcoming to the stage Professor Ilaria Capua. I'll leave you the stage, and I'll see you later. Thanks.
Thank you. Is this good? Yes? Hello. It's really nice to be here. You know why? Because I'm a virologist. And I spent most of my life in a dark, ugly room behind a microscope, trying to understand how pre-pandemic viruses become pandemic viruses. And now we find ourselves in the middle of one of the worst, I need a slide chair, here it is, in one of the worst pandemics that mankind has ever faced. And we cannot ignore what this pandemic is trying to tell us every day. And so what I've done is I have put together some pandemic teachings, which I hope will become learnings. And these pandemic teachings are not the truth. They are not necessarily the most important. They are here to make you think, because we are at a unique, changing moment. Pandemics are transformational events, and we have to take the good energy that comes with pandemics to find new ways forward. So here are my 7 pandemic teachings. They are mine, but you will have others. It doesn't matter. This is not really about the content, it's about the method. And so please bear with me for a few ideas. So number 1, okay. You guys really did not expect a pandemic, right? I was certain that a pandemic was going to come. It was just a matter of time. And you know why? Because we know that the health of humans is interconnected with the health of animals, because, by the way, just in case, we are animals. We're not plants, right? Okay. So our health is interconnected to the health of animals, of plants, and of the environment. And therefore, this needs to be the beating heart of how we react in the future to these problems. Because you know what? New pandemics are going to come. They are. This is history repeating itself. But also, some of the things that we would have never imagined. You're talking to someone who spent lots of time, okay, lots, behind understanding pandemics. And what we didn't see that was coming was that institutional denial can be fueled by social media, and it would cause the failure of any pandemic preparedness plan. Because people follow their leaders. And if their leaders ridicule what the WHO alarm of a public health emergency of international concern, what do we expect people to do? They're going to follow their leaders. And at that moment of denial, we lost half of our people, at least. Now, we've heard very much about this story. Vaccine equity is now a fundamental priority. We cannot mess around with this anymore. We have a world that needs to be protected from this virus, and we can do it with vaccines. But we need to think out of the box, because there are many countries that, for example, do not have electricity all the time, and therefore they do not have access to the cold chain. The cold chain means that the vaccines that we have now need to be stored and distributed at low or ultra-low temperature. And this is not equitable. We need to think of new vaccines. We need to think of vaccines that, for example, can be stored at room temperature and that can be delivered without having a gigantic box around it, which is actually a gigantic freezer that needs to be attached to electricity. There is no economy without healthy people. I'm so sorry I'm saying this for all the economists in the room. We need healthy people to make the economy turn. And health needs to be central and needs to be in all policies. And I would like you to keep this concept in mind, which was mentioned yesterday by Professor Mario Monti, because this is the core of the future. Resource sustainability and climate efforts must be accelerated. We cannot mess around with our planet anymore. We cannot pretend that this is not a closed system. This is a closed system. So maybe as economists you get this concept and you understand that whatever you do in one part of the system is going to have ramifications on the other parts of the system. Now, this was like a surprise. Really? COVID-19 is the most pervasive event that we have experienced, certainly the most pervasive health event. And you know what? It affects men, women, children. And you know what? They're not affected in the same way. And actually, we're seeing numbers and figures which none of us would have imagined. Women die less. Women most probably cost less. But women are the ones who have the greatest burden from this pandemic. And finally, we cannot continue talking to ourselves. We have to talk to people. We need to empower people because people are the engines of change, not the elite and not academics or people who sit behind microscopes like myself, or used to, rather. And so this brings me to the building blocks of the future. What are the building blocks of the future? Well, health is a system, okay? Health is something that is not only linked to humans, but it is linked to the rest of the planet. Agree? I think that more or less we can agree on that. Resource sufficiency and climate action are urgent. Social media, I think, are the greatest drivers of health in this particular moment. The virus behaves as a virus. Social media can fuel misinformation and get people confused and make them do the wrong thing, like not wearing a mask. We are going to have to wear a mask. We are going to have to continue getting vaccines, and we are going to have to listen to the right sources of information. People. We can't do anything without people. There's no way that we can manage the situation appropriately if individuals are not empowered to do the right things. We need healthy individuals for a healthy economy, or else there will be no economy. We need more equitable vaccines, and we need more equitable health care. And finally, we must understand the importance of diversity. But these are building blocks. And I want to take other words that were said yesterday. We need to think out of the box, because this is a transformational event. We cannot use the same concepts, the same ideas, the same building blocks we had before for a world that's going to be so different from where we started off. And so, please, bear with me and look at how we can free those words. It's not about the boxes, it's not about the silos, it's about the concepts. And these concepts need to be freed from their box. And you know what? They need to be assembled in a different way. These boxes need to transform themselves into a mechanism of convergence. At the center of that, we have health in all policies. And this is our priority. This is your priority. There's students in this room. This is something that you should fight for. This is something that you should lead. And this brings me to my last slide. Where is the new stuff? Where is the excitement? Where are you students going to be finding the solutions for a better future? You know where? In between those boxes. Interdisciplinarity, connecting things that were never connected before, and that now we can connect. We have incredible resources. We have big data. We have incredible computing capacities. And you know what we have? We have lots of people who are talking about how important it is to look beyond their borders, and they're not doing it. And so my cry and my invitation for you today is please, please, let's do it. Let's do this interdisciplinary convergence that is so essential to join the dots in what is a closed system. And with this, I thank you, and I wish you a very good meeting, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Professor Capua, thank you. Un applauso. She's great. Okay, so now it's time for me to leave definitely this stage, and I call up here Gianmario Verona, Ferdinando Nelli Ferozzi e Paolo Magri. And I leave you to the stage, gentlemen. Bye, guys.
Sono nel mezzo. Qui, lo stesso.
We should walk around as well, but we would never be able to stand the competition of the impressive presentation that Ilaria did. We are now at the closing session after 3 intense days, and we have the great pleasure and honor to have in this closing session the keynote address of Minister Daniele Franco, Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy. Minister, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate you found time to be with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. So dear colleagues, friends and participants, good afternoon. Allow me first to thank the T20 for inviting me to close this summit. As we are approaching the end of the Italian G20 presidency, I would like to share with you some reflections before the G20 Leaders Summit, which will take place in Rome at the end of October. As the global economy is now recovering, we can start looking at the future with guarded optimism. However, we should not forget the massive impact of the pandemic on our economies and societies. The global nature of the pandemic has reminded us that short-term and piecemeal solutions to global problems may prove not only ineffective, but even counterproductive. The pandemic has been a test that reminds all of us of the need for concerted actions. The need for coordinated and consistent policies across countries is not something new. Increasing economic and financial interdependence resulted from globalization has called for stepping up international cooperation. And as a result, we have witnessed an increase of coordination mechanisms of different natures and mandates. The G20 itself was created in 1999, also in response to the accelerated change in the balance of economic and political power across countries. Since its establishment, the G20 has been the primary forum of international economic cooperation, yet its features make it a peculiar forum. The G20 is an informal high-level group. It has no permanent secretariat. The agenda is set by the rotating annual presidency. The informal setting is instrumental to frank and direct discussions. Decisions are often the result of intense negotiations. However, each country has a sort of veto power. Therefore, decisions require consensus, and their legitimacy and enforcement are based on moral suasion and peer pressure. At the same time, reaching a consensus is facilitated by the limited number of participants if compared with other multilateral fora. This does not imply that the G20 is not representative. Its members represent more than 80% of global GDP, 75% of global trade, and almost 2/3 of the world population. The pandemic was a game changer, greatly increasing international cooperation. Let us think of the response to the global health crisis, but also of the unprecedented agreement that we are reaching on international taxation. These are results that were inconceivable only 2 years ago, when we were used to talk of the end of multilateralism. The Italian presidency did its best to facilitate the achievement of concrete progress. As you can understand, chairing the G20 is a delicate task, especially when the time for decision-making is compressed by the urgency of events. Unlike other crisis episodes, the response to the dramatic consequences of the pandemic has been prompt and massive on all fronts, fiscal, monetary, and financial. G20 members have continued to support the recovery throughout the crisis, avoiding the mistakes of the past in prematurely withdrawing support measures. More specifically, G20 members agreed on a joint action plan in response to the pandemic, which has set out the key principles guiding the coordinated actions to the crisis. The Italian presidency has shaped its agenda around 3 pillars: people, planet, and prosperity. Allow me to share with you some examples of how the multilateral spirit of the G20 has been relaunched. First, G20 members have concurred on the importance to enhance our prevention, preparedness, and response capability against future health threats. To this end, the G20 has been working to strengthen cooperation and policy coherence among key stakeholders, while addressing the financing for pandemic preparedness. These works are expected to be finalized at the joint meeting of finance and health ministers at the end of October. Our ambition is to launch a global health and finance board to improve international governance and coordination between health and finance policymakers, one of the weakest links of the response to the COVID-19 crisis. Second, last July, the G20 achieved a historic political agreement on a fairer international tax architecture and endorsed the key components of the 2 pillars on the allocation of taxing rights on profits of multinational enterprises and the global minimum effective corporate taxation. This agreement is intended to bring stability and predictability in the global corporate tax framework, preventing race to the bottom phenomena. Some remaining technical issues need to be finalized in October for the new rules to be implemented. Third, the support to vulnerable countries. Emerging and developing countries have paid a comparatively higher price due to the pandemic. To respond to their needs, G20 countries have first agreed on a debt moratorium, the so-called Debt Service Suspension Initiative, and then last July reached the consensus on the largest allocation of special drawing rights in the history of the International Monetary Fund, worth around $650 billion. This new SDR allocation has made substantial resources available for vulnerable countries. We are now building a political consensus on the option for channeling allocated SDRs to countries in need. The ambition is to announce a clear commitment to implement these options next week in Washington. Last but not least, this year, G20 discussion on green issues and on social economic implication of climate change have experienced a change of gear. In this regard, last July, G20 finance ministers and central bank governors committed to discuss the appropriate policy mix to shape just transitions towards decarbonized economies, including the use of carbon pricing. As part of this approach, we have also reestablished the Sustainable Finance Study Group and then upgraded it into a permanent G20 working group. This group is led by China and the United States and is developing a multi-year roadmap which will serve as a compass to orient future G20 works on climate and broader sustainability issues. Few could have predicted this achievement 1 year ago. All countries contributed to these results. We have now the last mile of our G20 presidency ahead of us. We will continue to promote the dialogue among members to complete our work program. This will leave a lasting legacy to the Indonesian presidency that will surely design an equally ambitious agenda. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister. We understand you can stay with us a few more minutes and hear with us the remarks, the closing remarks of the T20 Co-Chair and the Troika with our Indonesian and Saudi colleagues. So I will immediately give the floor to Gianmario Verona, Rector of Bocconi University, Co-Chair of the Summit, host of these 3 days.
Thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure, of course, to have the opportunity to host this prestigious event, which turned out to be extremely also successful. I'm sure Paolo Magri will give you some highlights also of the impressive numbers we have produced in these 3 days. Let me also say that on behalf of Bocconi community has been also beautiful to see so many people in presence in our auditorium for the first time after 1 year and a half. So I wholeheartedly thank specifically not only all the attendees from different institutions, but all the students that have been so close to this summit and showed how also from Italy, and specifically in this case from Bocconi University, we are into these crucial problems for the future of the society. I must say that we have heard important issues that have been remarked by distinguished speakers, I guess about 50 speakers that paced each other the baton session after session in these 3 days. And the most important thing, I'm not an expert of these specific think tank events, but there was a lot of action plan that have been proposed. And so I believe that really, as Minister Franco was just saying, the G20 at the end of the month will be crucial, and I really hope that the contributions of all of the speakers and all the task forces will really be something that will allow the G20 to really produce important action. Even because one thing that was made clear by many speakers is that with complex problems that characterize the global world in these days, and with issues like the pandemic, only important platforms like the G20 can really contribute to find solutions. So I really hope that we can really find important solution in this respect. Let me simply conclude by making a series of acknowledgements, given that we are the physical hosting institution of the event. So I would wholeheartedly thank, of course, ISPI for as national coordinator for this event, and specifically Paolo Magri, which is here with me. I would like to wholeheartedly thank also the team, ISPI and Bocconi, that worked very hard behind the curtains. So let me very briefly also remind all the names: Francesco Rocchetti, Antonio Villafranca, Alessia Casetta, Laura De Valba, and Silvia Colombo, and all the digital partners that made this possible. This possible in these 3 days. I think we have learned a lot in this last year of pandemic, and we have become extremely also effective in running these hybrid events. And I guess that this is very important, because this event represented, in my view, also potential, prototype of the future of conferences, in which we'll have more and more physical events, but also connected with many people online. And again, thank you so much for all the students and for all the attendees for this event and the keynote speaker. And a real good luck. I see that Minister Franco is still here with us. Good luck for the G20, because we really need important solution in the next months. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianmario. Ambassador Nelly Feroci is president of IAI. IAI has been the T20 co-chair over this long journey. Ferdinando, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paolo. Yes, you rightly said we've collaborated very actively with ISPI in the organization of this T20. And I wish to congratulate ISPI and the whole team of ISPI for the very successful T20 Summit. I've been present today. I've seen on the web the proceedings of the day before, and I think it's been a very successful event. Now, T20 has been very active since January, if I remember correctly, in delivering a number of analyses, ideas, proposals, but what is more important, policy recommendations that are addressed to the G20, as you know. As it has been said today and the day before, the agendas of the D20 and of the G20 inevitably have been affected by the impact of COVID-19. This goes without saying. We had to adapt also our own agenda of G20 to the new realities of the COVID and post-COVID scenario. The pandemic has been probably the most dramatic phenomenon since many years on the global scene. It has had a number of effects, sanitary and health emergency, a social emergency and economic recession, probably the most dramatic since 1945. Now we are probably hopefully entered into a new phase that I would define as a post-COVID phase. All economic forecasts from all major international organizations show that there are now good signs of economic recovery, that production is coming back to normal, and also international trade volumes are coming back to normal. But by the way, COVID has also had an impact on the scenario of international relations. Some of the trends that already existed before COVID have been accentuated, if I may say so. We have seen the crisis of multilateralism. We've seen the agendas of numerous international organizations being reshaped, new priorities for global governance, new priorities for the G20, by the way, in a context of an intensified competition, global competition among the major stakeholders in the international scene. All this is to say that there is a need for more and better international cooperation, and there comes the role of G20. The answers to what I would define the pre-COVID challenges, like, for instance, growing inequalities in income distribution, or climate change, or digital transition are still there, and COVID have only contributed to make those challenges more difficult and more complicated to handle. And then there are new challenges that are emerging as a consequence of COVID. An enormous increase in public debt everywhere in the world, particularly in Europe. New need for a better coordination of macroeconomic policy needed to stimulate sustainable growth. And of course, it goes without saying, Ilaria Kappa was very powerful in her intervention and need to work for a better preparedness against future pandemics. They may, unfortunately, appear on the international scene. Now, as far as T20 is concerned, I think that we have done a good job. An impressive number of events have been organized all along the year. 11 task forces have been working. You have heard the reports of some of these task forces from their co-chair, and I can only but thank all those that have contributed to the proceedings of the T20 task forces, the lead co-chair, the co-chairs, the coordinators, and all the experts that have contributed with their useful papers. The recommendations that have emerged from the work of the task forces will be delivered in a moment by Paolo Magri to Minister Franco, whom I thank for his presence here. I will now conclude by thanking all those who have contributed to the success of T20, and of course, first and foremost, my good friends from ISPI, Paolo Magri, Antonio Villafranca, and the rest of the team, but also a word of thanks to the two coordinators, T20 coordinators of Saudi Arabia and Indonesia will intervene in a moment, because they have had the task of ensuring continuity to the work of the T20. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ferdinando, and we are grateful for the fruitful cooperation with IAI and headed by Ettore Greco, and a great thanks to him as well. Now, as mentioned, we move to those who were before us, meaning Saudi Arabia, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Fahad Al-Turki, Chair of the T20 Saudi Arabia. Dear Fahad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paolo, and good afternoon. To everybody in Italy and around the world who are attending the T20 Summit. It's indeed an honor to be addressing this summit and joining you virtually and celebrating the many achievements of the past year. Having chaired the T20 Saudi Arabia, I know how much time has gone into the work you have produced and the organizational effort spent by the task force coordinators, the policy brief reviewers, the authors, the lead co-chairs and the co-chairs, as well as the T20 committee, or I should say committees, in making this year a success. I have no doubt that many sacrifices you have made will have produced a legacy that will be felt for many years to come. Let me touch on T20 Saudi Arabia and think how we have the continuity between Saudi and Italy. We focused on a vision of creating a future of prosperity, sustainability, and inclusion. Central to this work was furthering the prospect of youth and women and highlighting the role of digital technology to achieve the vision's 3 pillars. We also reaffirmed the necessity of multilateralism and the key role of international organizations to overcome our existing shared global challenges, especially with the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. We also highlighted the need for a circular recovery from the pandemic, advancing the carbon economy to support climate action, and balancing the challenges of food, energy, and water sustainability. Let me say that T20 Italy has continued to work on many of these crucial issues, taking the discussion on pandemic preparedness forward and arguing for the need for a holistic response to the complex set of disruptions they cause. This year's recommendation on employment and social cohesion have taken forth the work we did on enabling greater involvement of youth and women in the labor force, and the role that digital technology can play in facilitating this. The necessity of multilateralism was another theme that was continued this year. One key recommendation has been for a joint T20 G20 annual global risk report, which would be an important document for many institutions around the world. I'm proud to have helped develop the policy recommendations for the Task Force 11 of this year T20, which takes care of the reforming the T20. This is an important area of focus and will help the forum become more inclusive, impactful, and transparent, as well as enhance its continuity across successive years. A key focus here is on enabling a greater degree of participation from the Global South, targeting policy proposals at specific stakeholders, and differentiating between memo-style policy briefs and think pieces to facilitate communication with the policymakers. During T20 Saudi Arabia, we argued for more continuity between successive T20 years, for strengthening the legacy issues, and for representation, or greater representation, I should say, of the non-G20 countries in the T20 process. I am delighted that the T20 Italy has managed to progress these issues further. There is no doubt that the T20 process plays a crucial and unique role in global thought leadership. It is a rare privilege to have so many experts from around the world working together to produce actionable and timely policy recommendations. The work you have accomplished this year will only strengthen the forum's impact in the years ahead. I would like to thank you all for making this year a great success and look forward to seeing the impact of your work in the years ahead. Thank you very much, and back to you, Paolo.
Thanks, Fahad, and thanks for your advice in guiding our process this year. Now, before we hand over the final communique to Minister Franco, let me give the floor to Disman Simanjuntak, co-chair of T20 Indonesia. Disman, sorry, you have the floor. Don't see Disman.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, the co-chairs of T20 Indonesia 2022, myself representing the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Jakarta, and Professor Bambang Brojonegoro, our former Minister of Finance, now at the University of Indonesia, wish to congratulate ISPI and Bocconi University for the successful stewardship of T20 Italy throughout 2021. I'm sure that the policy briefs, the communique and other outputs of T20 2021 will produce fundamental positive impacts on policy making in the G20 countries as a group as well as individually. In planning for T20 Indonesia 2022, we attach a very high importance to continuity in full recognition of the enormous complexity of the issues confronting us in G20 countries and elsewhere. Thanks to scientists and researchers across all disciplines, we more or less know the goals that we seek to achieve. The devils, however, are in the transition in which different or even conflicting priorities will have to be aligned across borders as well as within each G20 countries. Having continuity and the urgent need for policy breakthroughs in mind, T20 Indonesia has planned to organize 9 task forces. Issues covered in these task forces are very much similar to those issues covered by the 11 task forces under the T20 Italy 2021. We wish to see active support to T20 Indonesia 2022 from all policy researchers and advocacy groups who have made the T20 Italy 2021 a success. We are all well informed about the fundamental issues facing us and the indispensable resetting or building back better or Green New Deal to deal with them innovatively. At the same time, we are also aware of the sticky realities we are living in because of technology lock-in, as well as policy-making constants or quasi-constants. In closing, I would like to underline that nothing meaningful will ever happen in the fundamental issues that we are faced with unless we continue to dialogue intensively and to cooperate. Unfortunately, global cooperation in our time is suffering from setbacks rather than progressing, even as we are fighting against COVID-19 pandemics. For that reason, T20 Indonesia 2022 includes 1 task force on global cooperation. As a separate task force, though the other 8 task forces, of course, are also tasked to find ways of reinventing effective cooperation in the respective fields. I hope that by November 2022, our war against COVID-19 pandemic would have been succeeded to the extent that physical connectivity across borders has been restored to a substantial extent, so that we can work together through hybrid modes, partly face-to-face, but probably mostly virtually. I thank ISPI Italy for the cooperation which has been extended already to T20 Indonesia, and hope to see many of our friends, at least virtually, in T20 Indonesia 2022, be it in the task forces and otherwise. Thank you very much, and once again, good luck to all of us.
Thank you. This is the end of the T20 journey. This, we hope, is the beginning of the journey of the ideas we have produced at the T20. Professor Monti yesterday said, if you want policies out of the box, you need someone to think out of the box. And we have tried hard with our friends, colleagues and partners to think out of the box. But as Ilaria Capua said in her last slide a few minutes ago, just talking is not enough. Let's do it. And with this in mind, Minister Franco, on behalf of the T20 Co-Chair, I virtually hand over to you the final communiqué. It's not thick. It's 1 page for each task force, so it can be easily read by everyone. Also, we are also invited to read it, and we really hope this is the beginning of the ideas, of the journey of the ideas of the T20.
Thank you, Paolo. On behalf of the Italian G20 presidency, I would like to congratulate the T20 for its remarkable contribution to our work. During our G20 presidency, moving along the lines, along the tracks of the Saudi presidency, we have strived to promote the collaboration with all engagement groups. And we do believe that this dialogue is key to inform the formulation and implementation of the G20 agenda each year. In this regard, the T20 has been instrumental to stimulate the discussion on the most effective policies to reach a stronger and more sustainable growth in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Building on your recommendation, we are confident that the dialogue with the T20 will continue under the Indonesian presidency. Indeed, continuity across presidencies is crucial. And I'm personally very happy about the cooperation of our Saudi and Indonesian colleagues. So let me finish by once more congratulating on behalf of our presidency, congratulating and thanking the T20 for its work. And I wish all the best to our Indonesian colleagues for the coming presidency. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Minister.
Thanks again for having found time to be with us, for being with us. Allow me now 1 minute of thanks as well. We have had a journey, and there are people and institutions who have driven us into this journey. Let me start with those who were with us in the journey. Bocconi University with the president, Professor Mario Monti, with the rector, and then Professor Bruni and Professor Boeri, IAI, which I mentioned before, Ambassador Nelly Feroci is here with us today, Ettore Greco and the rest of the team at IAI who helped us in this journey. Let me thank those who were before us, Fahad Al-Turki, our Saudi colleagues, which, as I said, provided many advice, fruitful and useful advice. And let me not thank, but wish all the best to our Indonesian friends. We will try to assist you discreetly as much as our colleagues and friends in Saudi Arabia did with us. Let me thank all the panelists, all the partners, all the sponsors, and let me thank you, the real and virtual audience of this event. We were very happy with the real audience, as Professor Verona said, but we were extremely happy also, and I'm thankful to all of them, to the virtual people, virtual audience who have followed us during this day. It's the end of the journey of a digital event. A digital event may appear intangible, unreal, somehow inexisting, but require even more hard work than a real event, and sometimes with less gratification. I wish to thank those who provide behind the scene, or behind the screen, I should say, the hard work that made this possible. Professor Verona anticipated the name of them, but let me repeat the people who are behind what has been on show, on screen this day. At ISPI, Antonio Villafranca, Alessia Casetta and Francesco Rocchetti, and the entire ISPI staff. At Bocconi, let me single out two names, but many more have helped. Silvia Colombo, who has been working with us since the very beginning of the journey, and Laura De Valba, who has been extremely precious in making this real event a reality. So thanks to everyone, and we will all gather again, or most of us gather again, for the Indonesian T20, G20. Grazie.